What's up, everybody? Welcome back to End of the Week. This is the end of the week for the 24th of January, 2026. Really excited to bring you this edition of the End of the Week where we are going to talk about a wide range of things. We've got 4 stories coming up this week, and I really look forward to talking to you about it as we continue to bring national security stories for the average American. Welcome back, everybody. It is your boy, Morgan Houston, aka Whiskey Mo, the internet's least famous academic. I am a scholar of irregular warfare, air power, and information, and we are here to talk about the national security stories that I have been following for the week. This is the episode for the 24th of January, 2026, and I have 4 stories for you this week that I'm going to talk about. Some of these are kind of condensed and combined, but 2 of them involve military requisitions, where we're talking about new systems that are being talked about and introduced. The second is Syria, and the third is Davos, and a couple of stories that have come about from the World Economic Forum. So for number 1, we have 2 new items that have been announced over the week. The first one, in a story from Defense One, the new one of the excuse me. The Chief of Naval Operations announced that there's going to be a next generation guided missile destroyer, and I know the Navy's surface warfare director in June said, I did not expect that I was going to be building a new battleship when I got this job, but here it is. The new thing about this is there's been a long discussion about a program called the DDG-X, which was kind of this idea about building a new battleship where instead of building it from scratch, they would take something from Europe and Korea. They would find a platform that was already there and then adapt it. However, because of cost overruns and some of the nascent things that happened with the needs for Americans, it kind of became a problem. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to update and create new systems for the American Navy as we try to expand and grow the Navy to meet the needs of the changing world. Additionally, there is a new space around some of the discussions about the capabilities that are going to be needed. So this is something I'm very interested to follow to see how this grows. I do think that there is a significant need to upgrade and update the current fleet for the Navy. I'm not a naval expert. I just know what I read from those experts, and there is some concern. I mean, we are still one of we as in the United States are still one of the most dominant naval powers that the Earth has ever seen, and I think it's time for some updates. And as we continue to think about great power competition and the shift to the Indo-PACOM area, we need to continue to grow and modernize. For those who don't know, Indo-PACOM is the Indian Ocean Pacific Ocean combined area of operations. That's what they call it in the DoD. Second is of the first 2 is going to be a new tank. This one I found really interesting. I was not expecting anything like this to come out. I honestly didn't even know that a new tank was in development for the U.S. Army. Apparently, there was a new tank that instead of this is going to be replacing the M1A1 Abrams tank, which is a phenomenal platform. However, it is getting a little bit long in the tooth. It was used in both invasions of Iraq. They give you an idea of how old that is. But one of the things to know is that what I think that this is one of those things that I think that right now, the way that systems are developed takes way too long. But what has made this unique is the fact that they decided, instead of trying to drill down every little niche and component that needed to go into the platform, they decided to build the platform first, give it to soldiers, let them test it, and then they are going to fill it as needed. So they're working on it. It's still in development as we speak, but I think what's really interesting is the fact that they're trying to speed things up. And I think this may be a really interesting and unique way that the Army and hopefully maybe DoD in general can revamp requisitions. It's a very long and daunting process. Some of the most recent data I saw states that it takes about 16 years for a system to go from RFP, request for proposals, to in use in the military. So that's a way too long of a process. So it's something that we can get into, and hopefully that this will help speed things up, and maybe also the modularity will be a good thing. Second is there are some issues that are happening in Syria. This actually comes from one of my my mentees in the Air Force Special Warfare Discord server that I take part of. The other day, one of them asked, "Hey, are you paying attention to what's going on in Syria?" And I said, "Well, that's a kind of a vague question. What is happening? What are you talking about?" And one of the things that they've talked about was the United States is beginning to think about pulling all of their troops out of Syria. Why is this happening? Essentially, what has happened is that the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the forces that the U.S. helped create that are predominantly Kurdish to fight the Bashar al-Assad regime, essentially are disappearing into nothingness. So what has happened is that Raqqa and a prison of Islamic State fighters and families has officially been taken over by the Syrian government, and they are slowly beginning to withdraw. This is one of the few times that we can hear about both the Syrian government forces and SDF forces having worked in tandem as they begin to prepare for certain things. In this case, it's the withdrawal, and it seems to have gone rather swimmingly as we begin to look at kind of maybe a possible end state within Syria. Syria is a very unique space right now in the fact that its current leader, the self-described president, is a former Islamic State fighter themselves. They say that they have denounced the ways of ISIL, ISIS, IS. It has gone by many names as it has both grown and decreased in size. However, there's a lot of concerns around Syrian government forces having Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or ISIS fighters within it. I know there was some images that popped up on Instagram about an ISIS flag being waved in Raqqa. I'm not sure how about the validity of it. I've only seen the Instagram and one source that's claiming it. But we do know that the SDF is beginning to withdraw. And as they become less relevant and possibly disappear, there's a lot of concern for Americans if they actually need to be in Syria anymore. One of the main reasons was to support the Kurdish forces there, both as they were fighting al-Assad forces, as well as ISIS. And now that seems to be a thing that is going away. So I'm interested to see what the decision will be. I don't think that the U.S. was going to be there forever. So we'll see how that time frame works. Now, our last story before we get into commentary is a bigger one. There are three major topics that I would like to talk about. And this is at the Davos World Economic Forum meeting. This is a meeting of mostly world leaders and really rich businessmen. We're talking the billionaires, your CEOs and your financiers. And this one was really watched intently as we saw the kind of the showdown between essentially Trump and the rest of the world. Some of the highlights that I wanted to address was Vladimir Zelensky gave a very fiery speech about the state of European defense, about NATO, and is it actually ready to defend against something like a full-on Russian invasion. And without using Trump or America within this speech, he was fairly clearly directing these arguments to say that, hey, Europe, we need to stop relying on the Americans for our defense. We need to be prepared in case we have to stand on our own. And I thought it was a wonderful speech. At the same time, he praised Trump, which in this day and age is probably always a good thing if you're looking to kind of maintain a friendship with him, or even just be on the radar to make sure that you get the support that you need. Number two was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech, where he was discussing great powers using economics as a weapon, infrastructure and tariffs, and this is not just, it was highly directed at the U.S., but also it was also talking about, leaning in, I think, a little bit towards China. There was some implication there. But what made this so unique is, one, besides the fact that Canada is separating itself from the United States, which they have been a stalwart ally of the U.S. for such a long time, is the fact that this comes on the heels of PM Carney having gone to China and secured some trade deals, including an electronic vehicles, an EV deal that is really unique because outside of the U.S., the majority of the world buys their EVs from China, and they are cheap and they are significantly well made from all accounts. So that is something that is really going to come in, and then that led to some conversations about the new Board of Peace and Canada's invitation being withdrawn, which Canada had apparently already denied. It gets a little wild, and I don't want to get into any kind of like locker room bullying or any of that kind of stuff. And then the last one, we had to talk about it for the third week in a row. We had to talk about Greenland. It looked pretty rough early on this week. I had a lot of other talking points. And in fact, I was going to turn this episode into why it was going to be dangerous for the U.S. to mount a military incursion around the ideas of irregular warfare and those kinds of things. But it appears that there is a backing off. At Davos, President Trump gave a pretty fiery speech, at one point promising military invasion, but also saying we weren't going to do it. There was a lot to it. And I think one of the most important things here is that essentially it's been backed off. There seems to be a deal between Denmark, the EU, NATO, and Trump in a way that essentially boils down to maintaining the status quo. This is it's kind of blown my mind, but we'll talk about it more in the commentary section. But what this essentially does is that it lends the possibility of allowing American air bases or American bases on Greenland to have American sovereignty so they can be claimed as American territory. It denies the rights of exploitations of resources to Russian companies, and then continues, and it's going to expand the 1951 agreement in between Denmark and the U.S. about the use of Greenland. So those are the big stories of the week. Welcome back, everybody. Let's get into some of these things. As it comes to, let's start at the top with requisitions. I think both of these things are really interesting. I don't know about I'll share the story that I read this about, and it's one of those things where with Donald Trump, you never know exactly what you're going to get when he says something, and he's talking about, he really likes gold, so he talks about Golden Dome, and in this case, he wants to talk about a Golden Fleet. And I think while his intentions may not be my intentions, I think both this and the story about the tank really sets up some good innovations within the defense requisitions space. I'm always concerned about how long that it takes. While we've never really been questioned or threatened as the top of the technological powers of the military spaces, I think there is a chance if we rest on our laurels that we could no longer be head and shoulders above, and we could be fighting to try and maintain our space as the top of the world when it comes to military power. And I think both of these cases are chances where we could see something really interesting. And what we end up doing is we take the tank model of saying, hey, we're going to build the initial platform, and we don't need to worry about anything else. We'll create a bunch of modularity. And when we talk about the different types of units, like say 4th Infantry Division out of Fort Carson versus what they need at say one of the armored reconnaissance or the ACRs, the armored cavalry regiments in say like Fort Polk or something like that. We can adapt those tanks and what's needed in them to fit soldiers' needs. And even within say a battalion, you can have different troops. Like this company, or this tank crew knows that they need this thing. Like you have your standards, you have your radios and some sensors and things, but maybe there's some other things that these other crews have figured out that they need. I think there's a lot of opportunity for some really interesting things, and I'm really excited to see how this works out. And I'm really hoping, one of the things that I've learned recently in a course that I took on the defense industrial base was, how we went from after World War II, about 51 defense contractors, to a prime 5, and it's really I think hampering our ability to continue to innovate at the proper pace. Like I think we're still innovating, but we need to innovate at a proper pace. Now, next, Syria. I think this is a very interesting topic. On one hand, I think that the U.S. really needs to do a really good job of protecting and supporting Kurdish forces. We have not done a great job of protecting and upholding our promises to the Kurdish people throughout the years. We've left them high and dry a few times. I know I fought with them in Iraq in 2003, and they're wonderful people, and they have a warrior spirit. They truly are great descendants of Saladin. But I think we really need to support them. But at the same time, we also need to understand what the democratic process, or even just the government process in Syria, is going to look like. We as Americans need to understand that we can't always force our type of government, that being a constitutional republic with representative democracy, onto other people. Those kinds of things don't always work elsewhere. We need to understand that we need to allow countries to have their own space. They need to exploit and monetize their own resources, all of these things. So I'm really interested in to see, hopefully we can have some clarity on the plans on if Syria is going to pull back, or the U.S. is going to pull out of Syria, and what's gonna happen there. I think it's a long process that is going to be, we need to watch, because the region itself, the Middle East, the Levant, however you want to talk about it, is something that is pretty brutal, an area that has always been a powder keg, and it's always on the edge of being lit. And I think it's something that we need to watch, because it will imminently have national security implications, just because of the nature of the resources that are available there. Now, as we come to Davos, I think the most important takeaway is that there is not a chance of Greenland being invaded militarily by the U.S., which I thought was going to be a horrendous decision if we ever happened. People complained about Afghanistan and Iraq. I think Greenland would have been even worse, and probably even bloodier, because of the backing of the support that we could have had. And I'm very glad to see that the threat of military force within Greenland has been pulled back, that we can eventually work as governments together to try and fix this thing that is happening. I think one of the things that all three of these stories from Davos really hits is the fact that an isolationist policy in America is really beginning to form. And I'm not sure if people are really thinking about the consequences of isolationism for America, because there's at least two different, if not three different types of isolationism at work here. There's the military isolation, where it seems that the president and his ideological supporters and his cabinet seem to think that America can do everything on its own. Even in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we constantly did it on our own, and everyone was back in the rear not supporting, which is blatantly untrue, as I can tell you from my experience in both of those countries. And number two, there's economic isolationism, which we just can't do. We are an integrated part of this global economy. We need to make sure that we maintain the global economy, because if the global economy falls, the American economy will fall, and that is just bad for everybody. And then the third one, and I guess there is a third one, is diplomatic isolationism. Going it alone on anything is really bad. It's going to be really hard, and eventually then you end up getting a coalition of countries that can eventually overthrow you, and that's not something we want. We want America. I may not want American primacy, but I do want American strength, and I want Americans to be successful. I want America to constantly be thriving, but I also want the rest of the world to thrive, because our national security is going to rest on countries not being volatile, on countries not being cesspools of violence and corruption. And one of the ways to do that is to support international organizations that uplift poverty levels, that make people educated so they're not susceptible to extremist ideologies, either religious or political or anything like that. And I'm hoping that we can take a lesson from here in Greenland, and to understand that we need to work together, and we can't just constantly threaten people, their economic systems, their standards, their economies, or threaten their people with violence to take something that we want, when in fact what we were actually talking about were things that we were already promised and allowed to do anyways. So I hope that you all took something away from this. As always, if you found value in this, please click all the buttons, the big ones down below. Please click the thumbs up button. Gently caress it. We don't need to condone any more violence than is needed in the world. Please subscribe. I know people say that all the time, but the things that I have learned as I've been watching this thing is that if you subscribe, it shows both the podcatchers, the pod distributors, and YouTube that there is value to this and that other people could get some value from it as well. So please subscribe if you're interested. If you think others would be interested or may disagree and they want to get into the comments and have a discussion with me, share it with them. I'm here for it all. And if you want to see this every week, Saturdays at 12 p.m. Mountain, when it comes out, hit that notification bell. That one you can hit because I don't mind a good dong from a bell. It sounds great. I really appreciate that, y'all. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see you at the end of the week next time.